Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Natural Gas Engineering Internship at Petro. I hope all of you good and safe in these unusual times. My name is Rahima Babayeva, and I'm a fresh graduate from the University of Aberdeen. I have finished my Master of Science in Petroleum Engineering, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's session on behalf of Arab Oil and Gas Academy. I'd like to welcome you to the 8th session of our internship. Today's webinar is going to be about Introduction to Underground Gas Storage given by Zacharys Background. He is the Reservoir Storage Manager for WSP, a leader in underground energy storage consulting. Mr. Evans has over 13 years of reservoir gas storage experience, having spent the majority of his career as a senior storage engineer for the Columbia Gas GC Energy family of companies operating storage fields in the Appalachian Basin. He currently serves on the Southern Gas Association Underground Gas Storage Committee, is a two-time chair of the SGA's Underground Storage Roundtable, and is a member of Society of Petroleum Engineers International Boards as a regional director for North America. Now, before starting today's session, I'd like to mention that you can ask your question from question and QA part, and 3 or 5 questions will be answered by Mr. Evans. Let's welcome Mr. Evans. Mr. Evans, we are delighted to be here today.
Excellent. Well, Rahima, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for attending. And I hope today I can provide some good insight for you regarding the underground storage industry. And I'm very appreciative of all the people involved in Petro and Arab Oil and Gas Academy for putting on this program to allow folks like yourselves to learn more about different sectors of our industry. I will say that I will do my best to speak slowly. If I forget, please remind me. I do tend to speak fast. So today's topics we're going to cover. First, we're going to give an introduction into the types of underground storage and their uses. As we'll see, there are different types of underground storage, and there's different applications for each. We'll talk in detail about the 2 major kinds. First, which will be salt caverns. That's the first and most lucrative form of storage, but it does have its limitations. And then we'll go into detail on reservoir and aquifer storage, which is more common and is more, is very similar to a lot of the things we study as petroleum engineers. Then we'll give a little bit deeper dive into the natural gas storage market here in the US, because not only is that where I have a lot of expertise, but it's a good example of how storage serves supply and demand markets and why it's a good commercial operation. And then we'll summarize at the end, and I'll be happy to take any questions that folks might have. The content will run for about 45 minutes, just under an hour, and then I'm happy to take as many questions as we have towards the end. So Rahima provided a little bit of background, but just to give you an idea of who I am and where I'm coming from. I do have a degree in petroleum engineering, so I am a petroleum engineer by trade. I started my career with Schlumberger as a directional drilling and MWD hand, and I had the privilege of working all around the world, including stops in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Australia. But I'm originally from the US here in a state called West Virginia, and I moved back in 2006, and that's where I started my gas storage career. I did not know anything about gas storage. In fact, I knew basically as much as I'm sure most of you do about gas storage on this call today, because it's a very specific part of our industry. But I kind of found a job opportunity there, fell in love with it, and now I've spent the majority of my career, including to my current position, working in that side of the business. And as Rahima also mentioned, I am privileged to be on the board of SPE for this year. So I'm happy to be here, not just to support the internship on my own account and for my company, but also on behalf of SPE to encourage outreach to students. So when we talk about underground storage, it's a very simple concept. So underground storage is simply storing fluids, whether it's liquids or gases, whether it's hydrocarbons or something else, in geologic reservoirs underneath the ground during periods where there's a high supply for withdrawal at a period of higher demand, so that we can take advantage of that supply and demand balance. We can take advantage of differences in prices, and we can take advantage of strategic retention of reserves for things like reliability and emergency purposes and things like that. So that's what we're talking about when we say underground storage. There's a lot of different specifics that go into it, but that's basically the nutshell of it. Here in the US, I like to joke that though this is the technical definition, the real definition is underground storage is what keeps people from freezing to death during a cold winter day like today in the northern US, because the primary use of underground storage in the US is to store natural gas, so that in the winter, when there is not enough local production to keep up with demand for heating, storage can fill that gap. And that way we can live in places like New York City and Chicago and places like that. So when we talk about underground storage, what are the uses? What are the applications? So first is, like I said, is hydrocarbon storage, whether that's natural gas, whether that's crude oil, or whether that's some kind of refined product, be it LNG or some other kind of NGL type product that comes as a result of some kind of refining or fractionation. Those are all very common uses. In fact, the most common uses of storage. But we can also store other gases. Hydrogen is becoming more and more of a concern as hydrogen starts to move into the power generation market, as well as helium. Compressed air is a technology that hasn't been very successful commercially, but it is similar to hydrogen in the ability to take excess energy, store it into compressed air, and then using that thermal expansion as we bring it back out of storage to help drive power generation. We can also use it for disposal, not just for waste fluids, but also for things like carbon sequestration. So there's a lot of different ways that we can use storage, a lot of different fluids that we can store in these void spaces. But in general, it's all the same thing. We're just taking a commodity and putting it underground for storage. Now, who are the companies that are actually going to be operating this? So in the US and in most places, the biggest companies that are providing this are those transportation companies. So it's not necessarily the actual end users of the products or the suppliers of the products, though those are companies like that are involved as well. It's more about the pipeline companies, the independent storage companies, and the utilities and transmission companies that are moving these commodities from supply to demand markets. Midstream entities that will not only take possession for storage, but will also use that to strip down or provide that fractionation, like I mentioned. Refineries would hold storage contracts as well. The utilities themselves sometimes, especially if you're a natural gas distribution company, there's a lot of value to having storage so that as you get to the swings of your weather-driven forecast, if you have high demand needs on certain days, rather than having to go out and buy that gas on the market, which can be very expensive on the spot market, you can use your own storage supply either through a third party or through your own storage fields to provide that reliability and save yourself some money. And then there's also a value to national governments to hold storage contracts. For example, in the US, we have the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is a crude oil reserve down in the Gulf of Mexico and some salt caverns that actually my company developed for the Department of Energy back in the 70s. And there's a lot of other national oil companies across the world that have taken strategic reserves for emergency situations in the case of energy shortfalls or other concerns like that. Now, talking specifically about the types of underground storage, there's basically four main types, and we're going to talk about two of them in detail. Salt caverns are essentially the number one rated type of storage. It's essentially using salt deposits that have been injected into the geologic column, and then you're mining out a physical cavern through pumping of fresh water. So you're solution mining, it's often called, or leaching. You're creating that void space in the salt cavern, and then you're storing your liquids in there, either fluids in there, either liquids or gases. Depleted reservoirs are what we're more familiar with as petroleum engineers, because these are the same reservoirs that house the gas or the oil in production, but now that they've been produced, we're converting them over to storage because it makes perfect sense that if the reservoir held the gas originally, it would be a good long-term container for that gas going forward. We do not typically store liquids in the depleted reservoir, because then you have problems with saturation and getting actual, the same amount of commodities that you put in the ground back out. Liquids through porous media is not as simple as gas through porous media. Aquifers, exactly like depleted reservoirs, except that instead of having naturally occurring hydrocarbons, they had naturally occurring water. So you have the problem of produced water, but you also have the benefit of water drive that's aiding your pressure and aiding your production. And then the last one is very uncommon. It's hard rock caverns. And hard rock caverns are storage facilities that are used when there is not enough geology with either salt or with porous media to allow for some kind of traditional storage application. So hard rock caverns are actually mine caverns, room and pillar mining, just like you would mine for coal or other rare earth minerals. And then they're lined and then used to store liquids or gases too. Those are usually very shallow, much more infrequent. They're very expensive as well. But if you don't have the geology in the area of the country or in the area of the world where you need storage, this is a good option. So first, we're going to start talking about salt cavern. Here's a picture of a salt facility down in the Gulf. Each of these wells, it's usually a single well feature. Each of these wells is in a different spot on the salt dome. So they've mined a specific cavern that each of these will fill. So we'll talk about this in a little bit of detail. So the uses for salt caverns is mostly hydrocarbon storage, and it's mostly for liquids because, like I said, you can't store liquids in reservoirs. So this is really your only option for that. A lot of refined products go into here. So not necessarily crude oil. Like I said, the strategic reserve harbors crude, but normally this is for natural gas or for refined liquids. You can store compressed air as well. You can also store hydrogen. Like I said, that's becoming more and more of an issue. The problem is as we'll talk about, salt caverns don't exist everywhere. So you can't use it for that. And you can also dispose of waste, not just oil field waste or other municipal waste, but also the brine. You may take brine from one leaching operation and store it in another cavern that you're no longer using. So the operators are basically the same companies as I mentioned before, but with the difference being that there's a lot more players who are involved in the petrochemical industry. Again, because we're talking mostly liquids here, a lot of refineries and a lot of fractionation companies and processing companies will have salt cavern storage. And then also, this is different than reservoir storage, is salt producers. So if you're actually using the salt for commercial purposes, those entities will actually own storage too, because they're not just leaching out the salt to create a storage space, they're leaching out the salt to actually use for some kind of industrial purpose as well. When we talk about the geology of salt caverns, this is what really makes it such an ideal circumstance for storage. It's because salt has essentially no permeability and no porosity. It is incredibly tight. It has incredibly high integrity. So you have a very well-defined container, and so not only are you flowing the liquid through a void space, not through the pore space itself, but you're also dealing with a very tight boundary, whereas in a reservoir, we don't often have that. It's either a porosity or permeability pinch out, or some kind of gas-water contact, or some other kind of structural feature, which may not be a pure sealing point. So we have spill points and things like that. So if you look over here on the left, if you see the range of where the traditional salts and traditional kind of reservoir rocks lay on the porosity and permeability scale, you can see the shaded area. That's where your intact salt would be. So you see we're talking about infinitesimally small porosity and permeability, which makes it very, very integral. And over on the right, you can see that's because salt has the ability to heal. So the crystallization of the salt will allow it to compact and to even if it's been dilated or it has been crushed, it will essentially heal itself. Now, this is common to all minerals. This is not unique just to salt, but salt's chemical makeup allows this to happen at much lower temperatures, essentially in situ temperatures within the reservoir. So that's why it becomes such a good container. So that's why we want to use salt. And here's what the salt depositions look like. I don't know how many of you are geologists, but in case you want to look, most of it you see is like we see up here in the top, where you have salt from a molten or magmatic condition that because of tectonics or other kind of thermodynamic forces will work its way up through the sedimentary layers of the geologic column, and it will create these domes. They're often different shapes, but this is the most common one here that we see. And so that's what comes up and nears the surface, within a few thousand feet, and then you'll drill a well into that, and that's where you'll create your cavern. We also have bedded salt, which is less ideal because it's not uniform. You have these stringers of other depositional layers, so you don't have as much integrity, and you do have to worry about things like fill and stuff like that. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but this is ideal up here when we talk about a salt dome or a salt cavern being in a salt dome. This is what we're talking about, this image up here on the top. Now, when we're drilling a cavern well, it's actually not that much different than drilling a production well, with a few caveats. Number one, we're drilling first as a conduit so that we can provide fresh water. So essentially, it's a water flood if you think about it from oil and gas terms. But we're pumping in fresh water. We're letting it sit against the salt formation. It dissolves that salt, and then we'll pump that brine out and dispose of it. And that's what will create that cavern. Now, depending upon how big a cavern you want, and depending upon the size of or the type of salt in the dome and what kind of surface facilities you have, this can range from a few months to several years to adequately create the size of cavern that you want. So when you have that brine at the end, like we talked about, you can dispose of it in another storage reservoir. You can use it for processing, or you can use it for direct consumption, not necessarily in terms of table salt like we would eat, but here in the US, it's very common to use this type of salt to put on the roads, especially this time of year, to improve traction, to lower the freezing point of the ice on the roads for safety purposes. So that's basically what we're talking about when we construct a cavern. It's drilling one well as a conduit for the brine, leaching out that cavern, removing the brine. Now we have the cavern, and we can use that same well to pump in our storage liquid. Here's some visual examples of that, and you can do two different types of injection when you're creating the cavern. You can do direct injection, which is pumping down the main tubing string, and these tubing strings are very large in a salt cavern well. They can be up to 24 inches, simply because, again, we're not worried about porosity and permeability holding back pressure. We can pump these things up to very high pressures, 3,000 or 4,000 pounds. So we want to maximize the amount of rate that we get out of these. So when you do direct injection, you pump down the center and you cycle the brine out the backside. You'll see this kind of formation where it's bottom heavy. But you can do reverse injection where you pump down the annulus and then cycle the brine back out the main tubular, and that's where you see a top heavy. And there's different reasons for doing different things like this. But ultimately, you see the issue that we have over on the right, which is much like mining, we run into the issue of subsidence. So when you do take out that much material from below the surface, you have to make sure that you don't have an overburden, which is going to compromise the roof of the cavern because of that downward pressure, and you don't have any problems on the surface, either with your lines or with neighboring facilities when the ground level can and will decrease. And then taking another look at a cavern after it's been leached, this is the main difference between the bedded salt I mentioned and salt cavern in a domal salt, which is, if you look at the dome on the left, it's very uniform. You have a little bit of fill in the bottom, but ultimately it's not a huge issue. But over on the right, you see all these different layers of the beddings within the salt. And so you do still have a cavern, and you still will have some containment, but you'll have a lot more fill. You'll have a lot more production issues as you have that fill in the bottom, and you have the potential for there to be integrity issues if these individual layers are not sealing. So this is why this is not ideal. But ultimately, as we'll talk about here in a second, the geography is what really leads to this, because we would all choose to have a salt cavern in a dome, but we don't always get the geology. Like I said, the biggest difference between a traditional production well that you may be familiar with and a storage well in a salt cavern is the size of the tubulars, the type and the volume of cement that they use, and the completion type. So they're usually, like I said, very large diameter pipe, and it telescopes quite significantly because of the pressures that we're talking about. All of these casings will be submitted to surface. There is no way around that, just from an integrity standpoint and a regulatory standpoint. And the typical completion is a single hanging string off a packer that goes down into the center of the cavern, if not further down, because you do want that position to be low so that you can adequately remove fluid from the bottom of the salt cavern. So again, very similar, but a little bit different if you have more familiarity with traditional oil and gas wells. And here's just an acoustic image of what the salt cavern might actually look like from an actual cavern that we operate at my current company. And again, the main thing to take away from this slide is how different the caverns can be in terms of their size, in terms of their shape, in terms of their depth. And it all really comes down to the commercial reason you're developing the cavern. It needs to match the size and ultimately the cost of your commercial operation. So it needs to be as big as it can be, but also not too big, because you need to manage your efficiency and your productivity, it's very hard to turn over a storage volume if it's too large. So that's where you can see a lot of variation in the sizes and shapes of these caverns. Now, where's the salt around the world? So here in North America, most of the salt is in the American Gulf Coast, down around Louisiana and Texas. And that's where most of the facilities are located. There is some more salt up here in the Northeast, around the Great Lakes and into New York State, and then up through the Rocky Mountains, both in the US and Canada. And then as you can see globally, there is a lot of salt in the Middle East, in mainland Europe, as well as over in Russia. There haven't necessarily been as much development in those areas. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but you can see salt is all over the world, but there's massive areas within Africa, South America, even the continental US, where there just is not salt deposits. So we can't take advantage of this because we just don't have the geology. So looking at a global perspective, since I know we have a lot of international viewers attending today, there is a lot of use of salt caverns in Europe. Europe and the US are the largest two users of this kind of, not technology, but who have really exploited this kind of opportunity. Germany and the Netherlands use quite a lot, also in France and Poland. Traditional brine manufacturing, as well as gas storage. In recent years, Russia and China have really ramped up, but unfortunately with those companies, the specifics of the size and the number of facilities is a little bit difficult to come by, but we're seeing it broaden into areas. Also in Australia, they do gas storage down there. And then most recently, in fact, a couple of my colleagues, both at Aramco and ADNOC, have been developing salt storage for their own reliability within their national oil company type endeavors. So we're seeing a lot more storage now than there used to be in the past. And this is just talking about hydrocarbons. It's not even taking into consideration carbon sequestration or hydrogen storage. Here in the US, like I say, I'm located here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in this little where it says Charleston over here underneath Pittsburgh, underneath this gray area, that's where I sit today. But there is some salt here along the Ohio River and up into the Great Lakes and the Michigan Basin. A lot down here in the Gulf Coast, which is convenient because of the ports. You can ship your LNG and receive LNG there, and then up here through Canada and the US Rockies. So that's salt caverns in a nutshell. We're going to talk a little bit more about hard rock caverns. Like I said, hard rock caverns are applications you can use when you do not have a reservoir that's convenient, or you need to store liquid and a reservoir is not going to work, but you don't have the geology we mentioned to be able to develop a salt cavern. So in this case, you literally just mine a cavern, or mine a cavern, in the same way you would mine for coal, just a room and pillar type mining operation. And then you drill some shafts to allow access to the surface. And then you would line those caverns and then use them essentially as underground storage tanks for whatever liquid that you needed to store. So this is very expensive and is very rare, but it is a good solution mostly for refineries that need access and cannot store the volumes that they need to in above ground tanks, right? Because those pose their own problems, both regulatory and operationally. So a couple pictures of what we're talking about here. These are the mining operations that we're mentioning. So again, we're not drilling wells here. This is not a traditional oil and gas type operation. But when you're talking about storage, this is definitely one of the other options. So most of your storage companies or consultancies will have some experience in this type of storage too, even if it is much more uncommon than the other types of storage we already mentioned. Here's a kind of a 3D layout of what we're talking about. You'd have a refinery on surface. You'd have some surface, even maybe possibly with a port. You'll have surface storage, but if you want to increase your storage to a level beyond surface tanks, like I said, you'll drill that shaft down. You'll drill these mined caverns in parallel. You'll connect them, and then this will serve essentially as your underground storage tank. So as you can tell, I'm not an expert on hard rock, so I go over that very quickly, but it is important, I think, to at least mention it because it is as an option. But I want to talk more in depth about reservoir and aquifer storage, not only because it's much more common, and it's much more common for you folks around the world because it is not geologically dependent the same way that salt is, but also this is what I've worked on most of my life, so I can provide a little bit more expertise here. So this is what a storage facility would look like on surface. This is one out in California, so it doesn't really look any different than a production field. There's not a ton of, other than the compressor station, there's not a lot of surface disruption. But when we talk about storage for reservoirs, We're using this again for hydrocarbon storage. Now, there has been a look, especially in the US, when oil futures went negative back in March and April. There was a look at, can we start storing oil in depleted reservoirs? So there was, I know the government looked into that, and my own company was brought in to kind of consult on that. That would not be good, in my opinion, but it has been discussed, mostly just because it's, like I said, it's difficult to get 100% returns on your stored volume because of things like wettability and saturations and things like that. So, but we mostly store natural gas. We can also store other things. The U.S. actually has a strategic helium reserve. I still, to this day, don't know what they use the helium for, but there is a field out in Oklahoma that stores helium. And like I said, more and more we start hearing about hydrogen and different research projects with the U.S. government and other places around the world looking at, can we start storing hydrogen in the same way we store natural gas so that we can use it in our power generation down the road. Carbon sequestration is very big right now. So essentially just disposal, but of CO2, and then water disposal, another very common thing, both for oil field waste and for municipal waste. Again, the operators of storage are mostly going to be those pipeline and transmission companies who are going to use this as a service. They're essentially, I look at an example, a storage company is kind of like a shipping company. They've got warehouses, they've got trucks, they've got drivers, they ship things to and from. That's what the pipelines are doing in this case. They're making money off both the warehousing in terms of storage and also the transportation in terms of the pipelines, which mimic the trucks. But the power utilities also own storage as well, because it allows them to save some money by being able to store gas and other products during high supply, so that when they get into winter months, for example, they don't have to buy that natural gas on the market. It also provides them with reliability. If they have a pipeline failure or compression failure, they can use their storage to support that instead of having to turn off service or something like that. And then the public sector also has interest, not just from the strategic reserves that we talked about, but also from an environmental and governance kind of perspective. As we look towards more carbon sequestration, this is the kind of thing that we can take advantage of. Traditionally, it's not been very lucrative financially, which is why there hasn't been a lot developed independently, but the governments can step in and aid in that. It's important to recognize that most of the reservoirs that we're talking about for storage, especially here in the US, are old production facilities, meaning that they were converted to storage in many cases in the 60s or 70s. So a lot of these facilities have been operating for over 50 years. A lot of your international storage facilities are going to be younger than that, but still the point is to recognize that most of these facilities were previously used for production. So a lot of the wells, a lot of the pipeline, a lot of the surface equipment is very old, and so it needs to be maintained for integrity. It's not a new construction. Aquifers are very useful. Here in the US, it's mostly centralized in Illinois, so south of Chicago. That basin is where there was a lot of aquifer deposition originally. They're great in the sense that you don't lose as much pressure because you have water drive, but it does pose a lot of problems when you're producing the liquids because of how much extra water you produce. And the last thing to mention in terms of reservoir and aquifers is that for reservoir storage, you can utilize both primary porosity and secondary porosity, which is to mean primary, we're storing in the actual void space within the rock, but secondary porosity, we're just storing in the fractures, right? So if we have tectonic activity or fracturing or faulting, we can actually store in the fractures there. So in that case, it's kind of like a salt cavern because we're not trying to flow through the porosity of the media, we're just flowing through the fractures themselves, which have much higher permeability. When we're talking about reservoir storage, it's important to recognize that what makes for a good storage reservoir doesn't necessarily equal a good production reservoir, because they're very different aspects. We're using them very differently. For a production reservoir, we don't really care about, so much about long-term production or instantaneous rate other than that IP for reporting purposes. Even if we know it's going to have a decline, we know it's going to drop off, we just want that long-term production. In the case of storage, we need it to be very high deliverability because we need to deliver this commodity not over the course of several years or 10 or 20 years like a production well. It needs to be delivered over the course of one season, oftentimes in very short instances where 1 or 2 days we really need to maximize it. So these are basically the top 10 things for storage, at least in a reservoir. Number one is property rights. It's like anything else. If you don't have the rights to the minerals, you can't develop it, but it's different, at least here in the US. You're not it's not the same as a production lease because you're not paying a royalty based on what you're producing. You're paying to use the container. So it's not going to be as financially large of a payment as it would be for a production lease because we're not producing anything. You need to have closed reservoir. That's the most important. You have to have integrity. You cannot lose the gas well, in this case, gas. You need to have porosity and permeability, and it needs to be high enough, as I said, to provide those rates. And it needs to come in both porosity and permeability. You need to have a good amount of space, but you also need to have good flow so you can have good deliverability. You need both base and working gas. We'll talk a little bit about this more later. But the main thing to understand here is that the storage company doesn't own the gas that they cycle in and out. They'll take possession of that from a customer, but they won't actually take ownership of it. So the amount of gas that goes in and out of a reservoir within a cycle, that's all owned by the customer. That's called working gas. The base gas is the gas that's in the reservoir that provides that back pressure that allows the operator to cycle the working gas in and out. Because obviously you can't bring these reservoirs all the way down to abandonment pressure every year. You can't take a reservoir that was 1,000 pounds original discovery pressure and it was converted at 50 or 100 pounds. Well, you can't operate that at a low of 100 pounds because it would take a tremendous amount of horsepower or a very long time to cycle that gas out. So the storage operator will have a base gas, also called cushion gas, which will provide that pressure spread, say from 100 pounds to 400 pounds. And then they're only responsible for cycling the customer's gas between 400 and 1,000 pounds. So it's much easier to flow out without compression, much easier to move in a timely fashion. So you need to have both parts there. You need to have an adequate number of wells. You need to have adequate amount of horsepower, and you need to have an adequate amount and efficient layout and efficient sizing of pipelines. So all of these things go into play. If we use that shipping comparison earlier, you need to have enough trucks. The trucks need to be big enough, and you need to have a good enough highway system that you can get where you want to, so you don't slow down because of congestion, right? You need that peak day deliverability, and peak day, or design day, it's often called, is the term we use in the storage industry to quantify the abilities of our storage field when we're selling a contract. So this is basically what the field can do when it's at the latter end of a season. So usually somewhere between 20 and 40% of volume in storage. And this is how much my facility can serve. And so it needs to be able to hit that high rate, not just a long drawn out steady rate for the entire season, but it needs to be able to hit that max rate because it is very often weather dependent or an emergency type situation. So it's not just about providing consistent production or deliverability. It needs to have the ability to provide really high deliverability in a short term. You need to have good measurement. Measurement is the cash register for gas storage. If you don't have good measurement, you don't have a good storage field. You need to be able to account for the gas that comes in and out. But more than anything, you need to have a market. Any of the things we talked about, the geology, the facilities, the design, none of that matters if you don't have a good commercial reason for storage. You basically have to have a reason to store something. And so that means you have to have a market, whether it's utility, whether it's a power plant, whether it's a refinery, no matter what it is, it needs to be in place, and it needs to be geographically convenient to where the storage field is. I'm sure that a lot of you are very familiar with this, but just a reminder, in reservoir storage, we're storing in the pore space within the rocks. Again, this is a pretty basic concept, but just remembering here that we're doing the same thing we're doing in production. We're fighting against permeability and the other geologic factors that go into pore space storage. I mentioned that reservoir storage is relies heavily on closure of the reservoir. You can't have these facilities operating for 30, 50, close to 100 years if you are going to have migration, if you have leak off and spill points. So you need to make sure that no matter what the bounding mechanism is, that your facility is integral. We talked about with the salt cavern, it's very easy because salt is sealing, it's a single well formation. We have a very high level of certainty that our container is pure. But in the case of an underground reservoir, we don't have that certainty. So we need to make sure that we have some kind of trap, whether it's stratigraphic, from a layering, whether it's structural because of tectonic activity, or whether it's an aquifer, so we're bounded by water. We need to have that closure. That is more important than any of the other aspects as far as the design goes. And when we talk about this trap, we talk about these types of traps. We see the strat traps over here, where we do have differences in bedding that creates an impermeable layer that allows for the collection of a hydrocarbon or of water during initial deposition, but we can use it for storage. Structural traps like anticlines, synclines, and other things of that nature, where we have a trap that's not based on layering per se, but based on the structure. And then faulting is an example of another structural trap, where you'll have tectonic activity and the blocks will shift, and you'll have an impermeable layer against a permeable layer, and that will create situations like you see here, where we can have a integral container we can use for storage. So that gives you the background on reservoir storage as a concept. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we use it here in the US. Now, in some cases, depending upon where you're sitting, this may be very similar, especially if you're in Europe. Europe uses a lot of gas storage to provide natural gas heat. If you're located in the Middle East, maybe it's not as similar to this, just because you don't have the same kind of weather patterns, so you won't have the same needs. But the concepts are important to understand, because again, the whole point of storage is we store something now for when we need it later. Well, in the US, we store gas now because we're going to need it when it gets cold. But wherever you are, there's going to be different commercial reasons why you want to store something now for use later. Maybe it's just pricing and arbitrage and playing the markets. Maybe it's some other kind of commercial issue, industrial use, or reliability need. So it's just the concepts may be different in the detail, but overall they're very similar. So when we talked about natural gas storage locations here in the US, most of them are up here around where I sit, which is kind of why I got into the business, because it's a local business. And the reason there's a lot of storage up here in the Appalachian Basin, we call this, up here in Michigan around the Great Lakes, and here in the Illinois Basin, which is just around Chicago, is because this is where there was both geology, which made it convenient to store gas, but also these are the parts of the country which need the gas most during winter heating. This is the parts of the country where it gets cold. You might be asking yourself, why isn't there a lot more storage over here around Washington, D.C. and New York City and Philadelphia and some of these other larger cities you may be aware of? Well, the problem is even though we have a market here, we don't have the geology to support it. There is no salt over here. There is no appropriate reservoirs over here. So this is the area where we have the storage capability from the rock, and it's as close as we can get to ultimately to the market. So that's where pipelines fill the difference. A lot of pipelines will come up from the Gulf and will bring gas to store in these areas up here in the Northeast, and then we'll distribute that to the East Coast and the Midwest throughout the winter. That's a predominant use. Most of the salt cavern, as you can see, is down here on the Gulf. Most of the aquifers over here in the middle of the country, and then reservoirs are spread around the country and around the world because reservoirs are much more common. Don't get too lost in this, but this just shows an example of the size and the quantity of these different types amongst the 10 largest storage states in the Union. So you'll see some traditional oil and gas states like Texas, Louisiana, California, Oklahoma, but you'll also see some states you may not be as familiar with, like Michigan or Illinois or West Virginia, which is my home state, Montana, Ohio. But again, this is because these are not necessarily the states where we have the highest production. It's the states where we have the greatest need for storage. So there's a good combination, but you can see here that there's a much higher quantity of depleted reservoirs than any of the other two. Really, all of our aquifers really just sit in Illinois, and then we have a handful of salt facilities. Now, this doesn't mean the individual salt domes themselves. They're lumped into facilities. So they'll often have companies will have multiple caverns in the same facility, but you can still see much smaller than the number of reservoirs. And so when we're looking at the specifics of the geology here, the main thing to take away from this slide is how highly variant or how great the differences are between the different applications. You can have depleted, in my time as a reservoir engineer for several companies, I've had storage fields that were 600 to 800 feet deep, that were 200 to 300 pounds maximum pressure, to being 6,000 to 8,000 feet deep and having 3,000 to 4,000 pounds pressure just on the reservoirs. And the same goes to a certain degree for aquifers, though they're usually much shallower and much lower pressure. But the high end, as you see at the bottom here, is that the domal salt has the highest average pressure, again, because it's a much more defined container, and that salt has higher integrity, so we can pressure that up, and we don't have to worry about things like frac gradient, for example, in the same way that we would with a traditional reservoir. So just an understanding of the different regimes here, depleted reservoirs all over the place when it comes to pressures, depths, and operating conditions. Salts are usually going to be much deeper and have a higher pressure. That's really all you need to take away from this. And as we look about the capacities and the deliverabilities, what's interesting here is you see, as you would expect, a very high amount of capacity amongst the depleted reservoirs and much lower amongst the aquifers and salts, simply because there aren't as many of them. But what's very interesting about this slide, I'm sorry, I thought I had a highlight here. But if you look down here at the capacity versus deliverability, you basically have an underperformance of the reservoirs when we look at it proportionally, because you have 85% of your capacity, but only doing 72% of the rate. Aquifers are pretty steady, but look at salt. Salt is really only accounts for 5% of our total capacity within the country, but it's doing almost 1/5 of the rate. So you can see how lucrative salt caverns are, again, if only we had the geology in all the areas of the country and of the world that we could take advantage of that. So when we look at the usage of storage in the US, this is something that's most people don't know about it, but this is very common. In fact, this year we set a record for storage capacity because of the pandemic and the lack of usage and consumption. We had the total capacity in the US for storage is 4 TCF of gas. Think about that, 4 TCF of gas every year that we pump in the ground and then take back out. And this past season, we actually reached very close to that national all-time high. And in a cold day like today, we're moving a lot of gas back out. We're actually getting very close to being at bottom of inventory, even though we've had a pretty cold winter here in the US, and we stored all of that gas last summer. So we're using this constantly. This is not some interesting thing that we don't really, we know about, but we don't really use that often. This is very much a part of our energy infrastructure. And so this talks a little bit more about the commercial uses. And like I said, for natural gas in the US, it's predominantly used for residential heating. There's not enough production during a cold day in winter in most of these areas to provide enough heat to keep people comfortable and to maintain quality of life, and honestly to keep people alive, because on a cold day like this, if you didn't have a heat source, there would be, it would be dangerous conditions. But it also, so it allows entities to store the gas in the summer when there's an abundance of production for that need in the winter when production can't keep up. But it also allows the pipeline companies to absorb swings, like I talked about with various outages and things like that. It also reduces costs because you can buy it cheaper when it's not during those peak times of the year. And it does provide that emergency service I mentioned in case you have a massive failure. But it also recently has had 2 new uses, which is, number one, even in my time over the last 15 years in storage, I could see in the summer that we saw less and less injections and actually some withdrawals in the summer, because when the weather gets pretty hot here, which is about 85 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, I don't know, is that like maybe like high 20s Celsius? That's when we start seeing an increase in electric generation from gas-fired power plants for air conditioning. So we started to see, as more and more power plants use gas for sourcing, we saw more and more use from storage to support that. And then there's also the opportunity, like I said, for arbitrage, for companies that don't necessarily have, they're not necessarily distributing the gas to the end customer, but they are looking at the opportunity, like in the stock market, to buy low and sell high. But unlike a financial transaction, this isn't just numbers in a computer. Someone has to physically take ownership and possession of the gas molecules, so they need storage to be able to do that. Here's where I see on my little chart over here where we start seeing that change over the years because of power generation, or we call it power load. That's where you sometimes see this weird withdrawal cycle in the middle of the summer when it gets very hot, because we're not just serving winter heating needs with the gas, but we're also summer electric generation needs. And this is the year-long production, or basically the yearly calendar of production. If we assume that the pipeline capacity is that production, which is kind of, it's pretty consistent throughout the year, that's what the wells, the regional production is bringing on. Anything that's below that in terms of demand need, we can basically store. And then everything above that in this orangish color, that's where we're going to be withdrawing. And so there's different terms for it: incremental, interruptible, peaking, storage, capacity service, but it's just different points on the calendar at different levels of criticality. But all of those are basically in reference to that pipeline capacity, which is your local production supply. I mentioned this earlier, but just to give you a better visualization, if you think about all the gas that's in the reservoir, let's say it's a 1,000-pound reservoir. Well, all of the pressure that's provided by the gas that was left over after production, at whatever point it became economically unsustainable to produce gas, let's say 50 pounds. That's when the production company walked away. So when we approached this reservoir to convert it for storage, the gas that's in the ground from 0 psi to 50 psi, we call that native gas. And there's no expectation that we're ever going to get that out. But in terms of our volumetric calculations, in terms of our inventory tracking, we need to account for that. Then we have the base and working gas, as I mentioned earlier. That base gas is going to be, for example, all the pressure support from 50 pounds, where that native gas was at conversion, up to the lower limits of your operating window, for what you've determined through your design process is going to be the most efficient and economical pressure cycling to move all of your customers' gas in and out in a timely fashion. So that may be from 50 pounds to 300 or 350 or 400 pounds. It's going to be based on how much compression you have, what your pipeline pressures are, both for delivery and for receipt. But that's going to be owned by the storage operator. And if you decided to abandon the facility, you could just produce that and sell that on the market too. So it's not a sunk cost per se, it's part of your capital plans. And then the working gas, I said, is owned by the customer, but that's the gas from that 400 pounds up to maximum operating pressure. That's the inventory you're moving in and out every year, sometimes in multiple cycles, but that's owned by the customer. That's their commodity. You're just storing it and transporting it for them. So that's never going to be on your books as a company. And then when we talk about operating these facilities, we talked a lot about the design, but let's talk a little bit about how we operate them. So each field is operated uniquely. It does not matter where they are, how close they are. I've operated fields in the past that were literally on the different side of the highway, right? So there's one here, and you can see the boundaries of each well field from one another, but they operated completely differently because they weren't connected, even though they were the same reservoir type of rock. One of them was closed off and was very water wet, while the other one was very dry. And as a result, we operated the fields differently. So you always have to take into account the geology, the fluids that are involved, how many wells you have, what kind of horsepower, compression, and surface facilities you have, and ultimately what your commercial needs are, what the markets are. Is this field one that we want to only use when it's very cold because it has very high peak day delivery, but it's a very small volume, so we want to save it for the most critical points of the year? Does this field have a portion that has maybe some H2S, or it has some natural oil, or it has very high water saturation? So we want to inject in certain parts and withdraw from certain parts and only use certain parts of the field and certain wells as a result. So a lot of different things go into operating these fields. It's very different than just all on, all off, maximum rates in and out all the time. It's a lot more complex than that. Like I mentioned, you can use parts of the field, you can inject into certain wells and withdraw from certain wells and really maximize your efficiency that way. But ultimately, all of it is governed by the weather. If there is no need, if it's a very mild winter and there isn't a lot of need for gas, then a lot of these fields are going to remain shut in. And then you have to figure out, how do we maintain that long-term integrity? Because all these fields are designed to turn the gas over. Even the best storage field, if you let it sit idle for 3-6 months, a year, that gas is going to dissipate to the lower pressure areas, even within the reservoir. And so it might be difficult to get that back because of it's just migrating to lower performance areas within the rock. So when we talk about the commercial value of gas storage, again, we've already talked about the companies that own the storage, or the companies that might use the storage, even if they don't own it, right? Maybe if you're a distribution company, you don't own your own storage, but you'll contract with a pipeline company and use their storage as a service. But you basically can make money off this, as I mentioned, by using the storage to provide that commodity storage for those supply demand targets. But you can also provide value for the storage operator through a program called Parking and Lending, which was approved by the federal government about 20 years ago, which basically says the storage operator can assist. So if they see an opportunity in the market to buy low and sell high, they can do that too, although it is highly regulated. And again, you cannot influence the performance of your contracts. So as long as you can do that successfully, it's a win-win for everybody. And then another thing is it's not just about providing the actual commodity service, it's also about providing reliability, right? So it's not just about being able to provide the actual physical molecules, because sometimes you have other ways that you can source that. It's about being able to provide a consistent, reliable service when you do have unexpected interruptions. So that's all the value from a commercial standpoint. You can charge for the shipment, the storage, and the usage. So in gas storage, this is a little bit complicated, but I'll try to explain it. But basically, you have two types of value. And in anything in life, there's two types of value. There's intrinsic, or essentially the concrete base value, and then the extrinsic value, which is the more complex abstract value. So if you look at this calendar that I'm showing here, and these are the gas prices that fluctuate as prices do for a variety of reasons. Let's say you took a contract here in April, where this first arrow indicates, for July delivery, right? So you're going to take that contract, you're going to take possession of the gas, and you're going to deliver it in July. So if you do that, whatever difference there is in price between where you bought it here in April and where you deliver in July, that's going to be intrinsic value. It's just arbitrage, which is the term I keep saying that I hope everyone knows, which basically just means, playing the system and buying low and selling it high and taking advantage of those price differences. So if you can buy the gas for, say, $1.50 in April, and you can sell it in July for $2, then that's pure profit. So that's the intrinsic value. Where the extrinsic value of gas storage comes is in, if you leave that in storage, it can continue to rise. If you leave this in storage in July, and let's say you hold it through the winter, obviously in the winter, it's going to be much more expensive because there's going to be more demand. And there's also extrinsic value in the ability to cycle it multiple times. So you can do this same process through storage, not just one single time, but you can do it multiple times across a season based on the performance of your facility. So this is why storage exists, because it is a lucrative commercial operation for companies that are able to execute it well. And when we talk about these commercial values in a little bit more detail, there are different contracts for literally every different storage operator, every different customer. I mean, when I worked so I previously worked at Columbia Gas, which is now known as TC Energy. They got purchased. They're the largest storage operator in North America. And so we had more storage wells and more storage fields than anyone else on the continent. And we probably had, 500 different kinds of contracts with different folks. So I'm not trying to get into the details of that because it would be impossible. But you just mainly need to understand that there are two types of contracts. One is a firm contract, and one is interruptible. And those contracts mean literally what those English words mean, which in the case of a firm contract, it is firm, which means that you are, as a storage operator, obligated to meet that every day of the year under every circumstance. And so this is a very high priority, very critical contract. So it obviously carries a little bit more of a cost. And the customers who need this firm service are those distribution companies who have a direct need that they can't afford to miss out on or not be able to service. So if we're talking about those non-traditional operators I mentioned earlier, that just might see advantages in the market where they can buy low and sell high, but still have to retain those molecules and somewhere to store it, like a lot of financial entities that do that. They can have interruptible service, which means, yes, they have a certain amount of gas that they want to move maybe for their contracts, but they can afford to miss a day or to be shut off or to be throttled because they're not delivering gas to actual businesses, actual homes, schools, hospitals, where they need that firm level of service. So it's a cheaper kind of service, but again, you do get deprioritized when it does come to those critical days where flow is maximized across the entire system. And within either of these contracts, you're basically paying for three types of service. If we use the same trucking example that I like to use, you've got your maximum daily quantity, your storage contract quantity, and your commodity charge. And that's a lot of kind of just insider terms that may be confusing, but this is basically all you need to know. The first charge is for the warehouse. You got to pay the shipping company for the space in the warehouse so that you can store the item that you want to store. In this case, it's a reservoir that stores natural gas. You have to pay for the capacity. The quantity, the contract quantity, is the rate. Now you're paying for how much I get out on a certain day. So in this case, you're paying for how many trucks that you're going to dedicate to me and how many shipments are you going to make sure I can meet my commercial obligations. in this case, it's wells and its delivery rate out of certain storage fields that have to be allocated to that contract. And finally, it's the commodity charge, because in both of those previous charges, you're paying for it in theory. I'm paying for a certain amount of warehouse space. I'm paying for a certain number of truckers or trucks or shipments scheduled. But if I don't actually use them, there is no additional cost to that. However, if I do use them, I've got to pay warehouse workers. I've got to pay truck drivers. I've got to pay for fuel that fuels the trucking fleet that does the shipment. So that is a charge that's based on how much of your storage capacity you actually use. So you buy a certain amount of capacity, you contract for a certain rate, and then you're charged a smaller fee based on whether or not you actually use it, because it does cost more to operate. And sometimes folks will not use their full supplement of service throughout the year. That's a lot of information. I've tried to talk slower. This is a full 10 minutes longer than when I did this last summer. So I think I did do a little bit better job of speaking slower. But I hope that you guys could take away some good content from this. In summarizing things, it's just important to recognize that underground storage in all of its different forms is a very common tool that we use in the oil and gas industry, as well as in the utility industry, as well as in commercial, industrial processing. A lot of different things use this, and it's very uncommon for people to know about. So hopefully today you learned something about a part of our industry and a part of the world's energy infrastructure that often goes forgotten about. And it doesn't matter which type of storage operation that you use, whether it's salt caverns or hard rocks or reservoirs or aquifers, they all serve the same purpose of storing a commodity that we need when we don't have as much demand for a time later, when we may be short on supply or we have an increase in demand. And this is not just, I know we talked a lot about the US because that's where my expertise is. But I think that's a good example of the kind of conditions that can be applied all around the world based on the different commercial drivers, the different markets you might have that would still allow you to take advantage of underground storage for that purpose. So with that, that's everything. This is my contact information. You're more than welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn, and this is my personal email. You're more than welcome to reach out to me there. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. And with that, I might turn it back over to our moderator. And if there are any questions in the chat, I'd be happy to answer them as well.
Thank you so much for this extremely insightful and informative session, Mr. Evans. We are grateful you took the time out of your busy schedule to address our group. Now, I would like to pursue with the questions of our audience. The first question is salt cavern as the same as halite? If yes, how can I inject fluid in it? And we know that salt layers are impermeable.
Yes, so in the case here, it's important to recognize it is similar to halite. I mean, the actual, and we use salt to describe a lot of different minerals in that family, right? So, but they're all very similar. The point being is that depending upon the type of salt, we're not injecting fluid into the salt itself. We're injecting the fluid into a void space that we have created within the salt. So this is not like a reservoir where we're drilling a well into the reservoir and then we're physically injecting directly into the reservoir and storing it in the fractures or in the pore space. For a salt cavern, we're drilling a well, then we're pumping fresh water in. We're allowing that fresh water to solution mine or leach or dissolve, depending upon which term you want to use. It dissolves that salt, and then we pump that brine out and it leaves a physical cavern. So in the case of salt, we're not actually using the mineral itself for storage. We're using the mineral as the bounding mechanism by which we can create a cavern and then store our liquids in there. So obviously the salt is going to be impermeable, but that's why it makes such a great container. So we have to use that leaching operation, as I mentioned, to create that man-made space. Whereas with a reservoir aquifer, we're using the naturally occurring space because it's in the porosity itself.
Thank you so much. Another question is, the entire process will require a large amount of CapEx as well as OpEx for storage and subsequent recovery of hydrocarbons, which will also cause some losses. So how feasible is it economically?
Yeah, so it's a good point. I mean, these are expensive. The main thing is to recognize that a lot of the reservoir storage, you can absorb that CapEx cost because of the facilities that are already in place. So by using the existing wells, existing pipeline, and in some cases, existing compression and gas treatment facilities, if it's a gas reservoir. You can cut down on that because a lot of times there's enough well coverage that you don't have to do any drilling. You have to do very modest remediation workovers and things like that. But you're right, it is very expensive, and that's why we haven't seen, I think the last commercially developed reservoir storage field in the US was all the way back in like 2008 or 2010. There have been infield expansions, but not a lot of green ones. But that's also because there isn't as much demand right now because there is a lot of storage capacity to begin with. When you're talking about a salt cavern, it is a high amount of CapEx, but it's actually not that much OpEx because it is a smaller facility. It's a single well facility, and the associated facilities can be bundled with other caverns. And a lot of these are in similar areas of the country, so they can take advantage of conjoined or mutual plants and things like that. But salt caverns are very lucrative because the commercial upside is so high because your rate and your volume is so high compared to the reservoirs. So I think I'm rambling a bit, but the question the question is very well stated. It is an expensive endeavor, but a lot of these facilities pre-exist current CapEx spending needs, and in the case of salt facilities, your initial CapEx is often dwarfed by the proceeds that are available because of the efficiency of the facility. But ultimately, the real heart of the question is, you can see the feasibility of it because of the number of facilities that operate around the globe. If it wasn't commercially feasible, then companies like I mentioned here in the U.S., in the mainland Europe, the national oil companies in the Middle East wouldn't be looking at actively developing it currently. So it's just all about the specific markets, the specific dollars and cents. But the question is correctly asked. Does this make financial sense? If it doesn't make financial sense, there's no point in doing it. It's also important to recognize that while the question was about hydrocarbons, there's a lot more look into this now for non-hydrocarbon storage. And at that point, you get government subsidies, which kind of offset that, whether it's a tax credit or a direct subsidy. So that makes some storage like carbon sequestration or hydrogen a little bit more palatable economically.
Thank you so much. And another question is, what about the microbial degradation occurring to stored hydrocarbon?
Yeah, so there isn't really a lot of, and we did talk about losses earlier too. There's not a lot of loss either from microbial interactions or other kind of chemical reactions downhole. And if you think about it, especially if we're storing hydrocarbons, most of these facilities house hydrocarbons originally. So you do have a certain degree of bacteria and storage reservoirs will need to maintain, biocide treatments and things like that. You will have some H2S pop up here and there. But on a grand scale of things, it's very much not an issue. I really cannot think of any degradation-based losses that come in time. Again, because in the case of a salt cavern, when you're storing crude oil, for example, there's very little interaction between the walls of the salt cavern itself and the crude oil. And in the case of reservoirs, you're again storing hydrocarbons that were really already in the facility. The main thing when it comes from bacteria is in a reservoir where you have a shallow gas water contact or shallow water table. If you do not have adequate cement on the backside, if you haven't protected your string, as a lot of these old production wells didn't, you can have a lot of corrosion that's driven by that bacterial activity from that gas water contact. So that's the biggest issue. It's less about losses and more about well integrity. So it's not really a big issue overall in storage in general.
Thank you so much. The next question is, what do you think about Lake Pennor salt mine accident? And do you think that salt cavern collapse at Lake Pennor should not decrease the use of salt structure underground storage?
So I won't weigh in with detailed take on that specific incident, simply because it wouldn't be appropriate for me because I don't know all the details. But it is not uncommon for there to be failures like this, and whether it's in salt caverns or in reservoirs. In fact, in the U.S., if you may be aware, there was an incident in 2016 called Aliso Canyon out in California, where a reservoir storage well had a parted casing incident. It took them several months to get it under control, and it leaked a lot of of natural gas out into unfortunately, a very wealthy neighborhood in California, and that resulted in a new round of federal regulations. So that is not common, but it certainly does happen. To answer the question, as far as do I think that should change the overall opinion of using salt cavern storage, or do I think that it will have an effect on other operators? My answer is no, simply because there will always be outliers to any case, and it just shows the need for prudent operation of any facility, whether it's a salt cavern or reservoir cavern, or it's something outside of the oil and gas industry. You will always have folks that may not be operating to the best of due diligence. And I'm not saying that's the case here, but there's always going to be complications as well when we're talking about complex situations, especially downhole. So that's why it's important to have all of the to follow all the regulations, to make sure that you actively monitor things like subsidence, like salt creep, flank distance, your operating pressures, running a lot of logs, running a lot of acoustics, doing a lot of imaging, to make sure that things like that don't happen. But we're very fortunate that for every instance like that, there are dozens and dozens of other facilities that have 30, 40, 50 years of operation with no issues. So I think the biggest takeaway from that is to making sure that all of the good, well-run operations and integral caverns don't run into that same issue by still following the prescribed regulatory rules and just being good stewards of the technology.
Thank you so much. And the last question is, when oil and gas is stored in a depleted reservoir, is all the stored volume recovered, or is there a volume that is lost? And if there were the case, would it be related to the permeability of the reservoir? Is there a possibility that hydrocarbons can migrate?
Yes, that's a good question. That was actually a question that was asked. I think that question gets asked every time I do one of these. That's a very common question, and it's a good question because, again, it goes back to the idea of what is our losses, not just from migration, but just from operational losses, because that's what makes this commercially viable, right? So the first thing I'll say is, again, I mentioned that the idea of storing oil in a reservoir is theoretical. That has never been executed, and I think it would be a disaster, but I mention it only because it has become, in 2020, it got looked at very hard because of the circumstances around the abundance of oil back in March and April. But in storing natural gas, there are a certain degree of losses that come with just operational losses, but that's more from fuel usage, from valve leak through, from pipeline losses that are pretty standard to any pipeline operation. There is not an expectation in design that a natural gas reservoir will have losses year over year. And it's mainly because if you operate something even with 1% loss for 50 years, you lose a lot of your volume, right? So there is no expectation of that. And that's why inventory management and verification is required by by the regulations to be done annually. And actually, my own company, we do a lot of verification for folks in an auditable fashion. But you really don't design for losses like that. When you do have losses, it's going to be more significant. It's going to be more structural based. It's going to be migration. You're going to have a pathway that you hadn't identified, that gas is creeping off into a different area of the storage horizon or into a different storage formation. You have a frac that may have fracked out of zone. Now you're losing gas through that. You have an uphole leak. You have foreign production, right? You might have a well near or in the footprint of your storage facility that a producer is operating and they're producing storage gas, or you have some other kind of spill point or something like that. So the losses that you're going to see aren't going to be incremental. There aren't going to be small losses. They're going to be more based on the containment of your reservoir as a whole. And that's why I focus so much on the importance of containment of your enclosure of your reservoir, because when you do see losses, it's not going to be fractional percentages. It's going to be 2, 3, 4%. You're going to see an end of season inventory adjustment calculation, and you're going to have lost $500 million or BCF of gas in theory based on the hysteresis and the pressure volume curves. That's when you start looking at what our issue is, and that's not going to be minor losses, and it's not going to be gas that's retained in water or some other kind of complex downhole interaction. It's going to be because you're physically losing that gas. It's migrating to a part of something else underground that you don't have well coverage for. So usually we don't plan for losses from a design standpoint. We really don't experience losses in the way that was described the losses that we see are going to be more monumental than that, and that's usually because of some reservoir containment issue.
Thanks a lot for answering our question with a special attention, and we hope we shall see you in our next session as well, Mr. Evans.
I'm always happy, and I really think this is a great program, and I really give a lot of praise to all of the. It looks like we had like 350 people watching. I really appreciate that you guys take the time out to learn about stuff like this. You'll be much better off for doing so. And thanks to Rahim and Ahmed and all the other team that have put this together. It's a great program, and I'm glad to be a part of it.
Thanks a lot. And also, please do not forget to finish and submit the quiz before deadline. Moreover, you can watch this webinar again from PioPetro's YouTube channel. Stay safe, everyone.